Hey, I'm Amelia Tran, Head of Digital and Field Marketing at iSpot.tv, a TV and streaming ad measurement solution. I'm extremely excited to dive into social media trends and emerging platforms with Kelsey Murray, Global Head of Social at NASDAQ, and Susan Chang, Head of Social at Dropbox today. Kelsey, mind introducing yourself?
Yes, thank you so much, Amelia, and thank you for having me. Very excited to be here with Susan to discuss social. So as she said, I'm Kelsey Murray, the Global Head of Social Media at NASDAQ. I'm based out of New York City. Our offices are in Times Square. Very exciting for all the companies who come in and go public on NASDAQ on a daily basis. But we are not just a US equities exchange. We are a global technology provider. So there are many, many business units all over the world that my team works with to create organic and paid social media strategies. And what's really exciting is that we're finally dipping our toe into influencer marketing this year. So we're heavy upping all those plans for strategic investments for platforms like TikTok pretty soon. But that's pretty much me.
Thanks. And Susan, take it away.
Yeah, I'm Susan Chang, head of social media at Dropbox. Dropbox is the tech company based out of San Francisco. I've been with the company a little over 7 years, and it's been great to see the company grow from a smaller size startup to the slightly more adult business that we are today. And it's been amazing to bring the social media team through that evolution as well. So I'm excited to be here. I'm one of the companies that went public with NASDAQ a few years ago. So it's great to, realize that we're all kind of a part of the same circles doing what we do. So I'm excited to start the panel.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, social media truly is a small world. But yeah, it kind of brings me into, our topic of emerging trends and platforms. It's been an integral part of our upbringing. I mean, we've had Zanga, MySpace, GoNext, Friendster to go way back. Platforms back then were used to make new friends and use as an outlet to share life updates. But now it's being used in a vastly different way. Because us as brands, advertisers, and content creators, we play a huge role when it comes to shaping consumer behavior. And coming out of those are trends that I see that has staying power, or it could just be the next shiny new toy that may disappear in the next 3 months. So that leads into my first question, and feel free, either one of you, to jump in. Thankfully, this is not too large of a panel, so we can definitely manage that. But which emerging platform or trend did you integrate and launch into your social plans before the pandemic, and what were the results of that?
Yeah, I can jump in. So obviously during the pandemic, things shifted so drastically in terms of content creation. What's great is that when you work in social, a lot of that stuff is done from your phone online. So although it was a huge lift to change a lot of the processes that we had put in place, we were able to pivot really quickly, which was very exciting. One of the things that we put in place right before the pandemic launched was we were doing, a lot of our key audiences are located on LinkedIn, C-suite decision makers, executive assistants, CTOs, CFOs, they're on LinkedIn. And for companies who come in to go public on NASDAQ, a great place to provide that thought leadership for some of those key C-suite executives is on LinkedIn. We have a daily show called Trade Talks, which is filmed in our market site location in Times Square with our global markets reporter, who interviews a lot of these thought leaders, as well as people on my team. And so in the past, we were doing this all in person. These companies come into NASDAQ every day to go public, ring the bell, celebrate, but that was no longer an option. And so we had to pivot a lot of those opportunities into live stream videos through Zoom. So we were pre-producing the content rather than doing it live. And we were shooting it via Zoom. We were adding it in post-production with B-roll, and then we were streaming it quote unquote live on NASDAQ's Twitter and LinkedIn channels the day that that company went public. But it meant that there had to be a lot more strategic due diligence ahead of the IPO day in order to make sure that all the right things were set in motion and all the content was finalized and approved prior to that. Because our audience thinks that content is technically live content content, even though it's been pre-produced. So we were already doing some of this work and streaming it to our LinkedIn channels in a testing phase, but we had to move from testing to executing extremely fast. And now now we stream upwards of 8, 9, 10 pieces of content on LinkedIn every single day, featuring different significant thought leaders. But to be honest with you, that shift had us expedite those things really quickly. And honestly, it's been a really successful thing overall since the pandemic happened.
That's awesome. Susan, anything to add there?
Yeah, what came to mind for me was also something around what I would call, I guess, like event social media or event support for social. So the last big project that we did before the pandemic hit was Sundance 2020 at the end of January. And so Dropbox, we've been going to Sundance for a few years because we really want to show the creative community, the community of filmmakers, directors, producers, and film crews that we appreciate and are inspired by their talent. And so we show up at that festival every year and tell our story to those filmmakers. And most of the social media support that is provided for that project is live social content creation from the people that are on the ground at Sundance. So we sponsor a portion of Sundance and we get access to all of these filmmakers and the talent that are in the movies that are premiering. And so we get just direct access to them. We created a series of Instagram stories based on the interviews that we got with all of the talent that were in the movies. And we just cut in real time, like live edits of that content and posted it to our Instagram story so that our followers could feel that they were at the festival with us. So we had day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4 content that we were posting, and it was fun. I mean, I miss that aspect of the job of like being at an event. And Kelsey, I know like most of you guys, that's what you guys did, you know, meeting all these companies in person. We obviously don't do that anymore, but I remember just pre-pandemic, like that just being like a huge part of the role that a social media team would play in just a larger marketing strategy of being at the event, creating quick, bite-sized, snackable content and uploading it to platforms such as Instagram stories that our communities could just consume that content right away.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Just to add on, last year I was still on the agency side before I moved on to iSpot. But yeah, when I was consulting Shell, who doesn't know Shell, Gas, Oil, and Energy, we basically ran a yearly program where we were on site to promote young engineers to create sustainable cars and solutions. So it was really awesome to go to like the Sonoma Raceway, for instance, and watch college students and even younger students from like Brazil, like Germany, all over the world come to California and actually build their cars on site. And we would have, people from Shell and other places and sponsors come in and just check how their mechanism was actually performing. Unfortunately, that was obviously something we had also done previously, maybe not so much an emerging platform, but I think events did play a huge role when it came to promoting our brand identity, you would say. It's still part of our DNA. But then as soon as the pandemic hit, we quickly had to pivot. Of course, we can't go to Sonoma anymore. What can we do on LinkedIn Live or Instagram Stories? Similar to what both of you guys said, we planned out pre-recorded content at different places and sites to then showcase and still show that experience. So I'm definitely with you there, which brings me to a little bit of what I know Kelsey had touched on, but throughout the pandemic and hopefully now that we're hopefully at the tail end of it, I'd love to know a little bit more in detail of how your social strategy adapted to the changing environment. What might have changed in your platform strategy, if anything did change?
Yeah, I can kick off for this one. So one thing we actually did as a direct reaction to the pandemic was something that we call our digital care packages. So in May of 2020, which was, deep into kind of quarantine mode for most of the world. We knew everybody was inside. Everybody was trying to keep busy and also trying to stay inspired and creative with all this new time that they had. And so what we did at Dropbox was we wanted to partner with a great list of creative influencers. Some of them were chefs, some were actors, designers, writers, and we wanted each of them to create a care package that they would put into a Dropbox folder of just their favorite pieces of content. So like the chefs would put in their recipes that they were making now that they were at home. Some of the designers would put in some like tips for how to interior decorate now that you were at home most of the time. And some of the writers put in some of their favorite short stories. So we partnered with each of the influencers, created these Dropbox folders and sent them out to the world and said, hey, we know that you're stuck inside. Here's a little bit of creativity. In terms of like platform strategy, we didn't do anything different except the biggest, I think, like highlight and the thing that I wanted to make sure that we did was really engage with the influencers. Because I think, again, during the quarantine, we were just missing like engagement and like connection with other people. So we wanted to make sure that we were partnering with the influencers really well and making sure that that like partnership was coming through. And I felt that most in terms of like engagement and kind of the authentic kind of support of each other from like Dropbox to these influencers through our Instagram channels. It just so happened that that's the channel that most of our influencers were the most active on. And it's also, if I think about it, the channel that makes resharing content and engaging with content the easiest. So when we launched that campaign, we relied a lot more heavily on distributing the content through Instagram, both through our feed and through our stories, and then just being able to like reshare each other's stories and interact with each other's content, because the influencers were also tasked with sharing out their Dropbox folders as well. That just was the most fruitful platform for us to go live on. And I think as a company, I'm really proud of that campaign, just because we were trying to be relevant, but also be very thoughtful about what we were trying to like latch onto in terms of a trend, because quarantine, it's not really like a trend. It was just kind of a state of the world. And so we didn't want it to look like we were trying to like benefit off of what the world was going through, but instead we were trying to show up in a place where, hey, we're trying to help as a brand, and here's just some fun content that you can look at. So yeah, that's what we did as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, awesome. No, I think that authenticity piece is something that people, especially during a time where everyone's kind of on the same boat, will always remember. So I always think it's in everyone's best interest to not be forceful and just be as authentic as possible. What about you, Kelsey? Like anything that you might want to elaborate? Because I know you definitely shared some gems in your first answer.
Yeah, I would just say that, like, kind of going off of that, we support so many different business units. Probably the biggest one that had the most significant impact right away was listings. So companies come in twice a day, 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. every single day to ring our opening and closing bell ceremony for the open and close of the markets. And a lot of times those companies, it's their IPO day itself. So there's typically, there's typically a welcome drinks or party of some kind later in the evening. Throughout the day, there's massive celebrations. There's an IPO first trade ceremony. And these, we weren't even allowed in our own offices, especially at the first part of the pandemic. And that's a big draw as to why companies go public in the first place. Like that sort of brand awareness and notoriety around that moment is significant and tends to go viral in a lot of cases. If you probably saw Bumble when they went public, the amount of, exposure it got. So we had to do a couple of things. As the pandemic went along, we were able to host those events at the brand's headquarters, because they were allowed to have maybe 15, 16 people in there. We would send like a camera crew and a lot of like our big podium branded with their colors and their names. And we would do big balloon tosses instead of confetti. So there was ways that we went around still being able to celebrate those companies in their big historical moments, but bring that experience to them. But that also meant that getting that content for social had to look a little bit different. And so, making sure that there were the right processes and frameworks in place to make sure that any content we were sharing, the people were social distance, that they were wearing masks, that it still followed really proper protocols in general across the content that we were promoting, but also got to be celebratory. So the second thing that we did was, a lot of times a company will be coming to NASDAQ with a lot of their employees, but let's say it's only 50 or 60 that they can ultimately send to New York City if they're coming from San Francisco or London, somewhere else. That means the global employee force of that company is not in MarketSite and not in our offices. And they still want to celebrate. So in the past, they got merchandise that they could share photos of them on social. But one of the biggest pivots we've made was allowing those employees to celebrate virtually. So what they do is they share a photo of themselves with us through our app, and then we project it onto our tower in Times Square, looking over Times Square. And then it's very meta. We take a photo of the photo and we feed it back into the app. And all the employees have literally a photo of them in Times Square. And some of them, especially during COVID, they were sharing photos of them with their dogs or them with their families, like fully repped out in their company's gear. And then that was shared on their social channels, and NASDAQ engaged with that content, which drove significant, it almost felt like we were celebrating in person, but we were doing it online. And what's great is that we made those pivots very quickly and efficiently so that they happened in real time. But now we're being able to extend that into post-COVID. I know we're not there yet, but a lot of the companies are coming in now and still only bringing 10, 15 people based on our protocols. So we're still allowing their global workforces to celebrate, but they're doing so virtually with these new apps and sort of tools that we put in place to make the experience special.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that you talked a little bit more about celebration. So I think both of your examples were awesome because it kind of showed how we try to make what a horrible situation that it was into something that we can still, talk about and live on, and still be very engaging with the people that are dealing with the same thing that we all are. I think one thing I want to add just from a B2B perspective is trying to tie in like social media with direct mail gifting as well too, because a lot of what I've seen B2B companies, that I'm partnered with myself personally have done is just, how can we really engage with, maybe like a lunch and learn on us. Back then people would come to our offices all the time and be able to, sell their product and have us learn about them. But obviously we're missing that component. But now it's been replaced with like, hey, how about an Uber gift card? And, we'll mail it to you. We'll give you the code like an hour before our meeting. And that way you can sit and enjoy lunch. We'll do all the talking and you do all the eating. That way you can still have a really fruitful like webinar conversation. Or one thing that I'm actually participating in soon is, a partner of mine sent me this really awesome like California wine tasting, but it was all virtual, and it still is, and it's great because they would bring a sommelier on camera and would actually like open the wines in person and try it. As tempting as it is not to open the wine before the event, I think it's really great because I think there's still like huge component when it comes to like prospecting and networking that you can still do virtually to show your B2B partners that you care. So I just, wanted to add that example because it ties into just some of the next things I want to ask. I guess just like quickly, I think we've already shared some really great examples, but what would you say is like top of mind, whether it's for your brand or just overall what you've seen in the industry as an emerging trend that may have come out of the pandemic?
I think from our end, what's interesting is that, social touches so many parts of the business of any marketing and communications funnel, right? Like paid social is technically under my team, but that's marketing. Organic social is brand storytelling and content creation. Then there's .com. There's so many, like social really is the crux of all of marketing and comms, which is exciting, but also sometimes hard to then scale processes because of that. One thing I feel like we're really in a good place after the pandemic, everyone was sort of on, at home. We had to figure out new ways of working together. And as we think about going back into the office, we've wanted to make sure that those stay in place so that we can, think through new campaigns and new things to try. And one of which is influencer marketing. And I think NASDAQ has always done a really great job of like making sure like leveraging our employees as brand ambassadors and working with CEOs and thought leaders. But also I think what we're really going to focus on in the future is tapping emerging platforms like Clubhouse or TikTok or Instagram Reels even, or LinkedIn stories, for instance. How are we tapping sort of consumer types of influencers who have really positive reputations across these platforms, how they can help us educate new audiences around what it means to get involved in the capital markets, whether it's investing, whether it's saving, whether it's just understanding the stock market, because there's a big portion of the world who doesn't understand it. And we need to make it a more diverse experience overall across every single group in America needs to be able to be involved in some capacity. So I think a big thing we want to lean on is financial education and financial literacy. And a lot of that is already being done by really, really interesting micro, macro, mid-tier influencers. They have fintech, fintalk kind of conversations happening consistently, and their audiences are super engaged because all people want to learn about how to be, best use their finances and be financially healthy. So anyways, I just think that one of the biggest things that we're going to dive into this year is really focusing on financial literacy, types of content across all different channels, but primarily leveraging and working with different partners of some kind to bring that content to life. So we're not sort of the boomer in the room when we walk into TikTok and try and create content there.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there, especially in financial literacy. It's almost like, we're all home. What are new things we can learn?
Exactly.
Susan, what are some of the emerging trends you've seen come out of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think in 2020, and I think everyone who paid attention to any social media brand saw this in that year, was how as a brand, you needed to be much more socially conscious and responsible. And that didn't actually mean like you had to have a point of view on everything that was going on in the world. For me, it actually meant the opposite of being thoughtful enough that, hey, if you see that this thing is going on in the news, let's not comment on it if the only reason why we're going to say something as a brand is for the sake of saying something. I think a lot of brands made that mistake because they felt like they needed to jump in on every trend. But I think taking a step back and thinking, oh, as a brand, how am I going to actually contribute to this conversation? How am I going to bring value to the conversation? How do I make it better? Because if I don't do any of those things, then as a brand, let's sit this one out, because we don't have to comment on everything. And I think our audiences in 2020 got much smarter as well, because once they smelled any like small scent of us trying to be a performative brand, or virtue signaling became a term that was used a lot. Any time that was sort of like detected, they would call the brands out. And most of the time, like, the people were right. I mean, there's a long list of brands that got in trouble for saying things and just seeming ignorant of the actual like issues that were going on in the world. And so I think as a brand, all of us in 2020 had to become very clear on what is important to us as a brand, what is something that we consider to be our core value. Because if you don't know that, if you don't know those things, and those things internally are not like permeated throughout all of the staff and the execs and the employees that work at the company, if that's not there internally, then you shouldn't be speaking on it externally. So I think, yeah, 2020 taught us a lot, not necessarily just about like platform trends, but just as a brand, like the responsibility you have as a social media team. Because as Kelsey said, like, social media is so many things. And one of those things is that we are kind of the face of the company. And we tell the company's story. And so Twitter, Instagram, whatever, Facebook, whatever channel, people go to those channels first to see, hey, how is this brand reacting to what just happened? Or I wonder what this brand has to say about this issue that's going on in the world. So I think as a social team, you're not just creating like fun Instagram stories, you're actually serving as a voice for the entire company, to the entire world who wants to see what you have to say. So you have to be super clear about what your company stands for and what you are willing to publicly state, because like I said, audiences are very smart and they will call you out for it if they feel like you're just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's kind of where we, as consultants of brands in the past, had also advised whenever like a client of mine would ask, like, "Hey, should I be shutting off social media this upcoming day?" And I'd be like, "Well, why don't we create a checklist?" Because it's literally how to resort to that, right? Because there's a lot of issues that came up, and like you said, each brand is a representation of a larger conversation. The influence of however the many thousands or millions of people that follow your platforms, they're going to listen and hear what you have to say, and sometimes their response might not be the way that you project. So you really want to be really careful with it. So I think for me, one of my learnings is not so much of a trend, but just to tie into what you both said is how do we address these issues, right, head on, right? Or does your brand really have a role in this, right? What's going to be the effect long term of your brand perception if you choose to participate or not participate? I kind of think that's kind of where we're at. And I think with that, we've had so much fun, talking about these trends and everything. I think we're about time to wrap up, but I wanted to make sure we had the time to focus on the next hot trend that in your minds, like, the audience should really know about. And if you are planning on testing that out with your company, how are you planning on rolling that out?
Yeah, for Dropbox platform wise, we aren't live on TikTok, but in 2022, I hope to be. So it's a channel that we're really excited to launch and create content for. I think we took kind of the last like year and a half, like debating, like, hey, do we want to be on TikTok? Just because the type of content on that channel is very different from the other channels that we currently publish on. But I think it's undeniable that TikTok is the future. It has the brightest future of all the social media channels, in my opinion. And I think for Dropbox, at first, I did struggle with thinking, how am I going to create content for this? How are we going to talk about cloud software on TikTok and make it interesting for the people viewing? But I think now that it's a year and a half later, it's time. Like we have to go live. And we're actually hiring someone right now to try to get someone in-house to just be able to create, again, this like quick bite-size, like more authentic content, something that doesn't have to be overproduced and doesn't have to look like a commercial, because I think that's the type of content that performs the best on TikTok. And so for us, yeah, TikTok is definitely where we want to go next. I feel like we're already a little bit behind and it's not even like an emerging platform anymore, but for Dropbox, that's where we have our eyes on in 2022.
Perfect. What about you, Kelsey?
Yeah, I would have to say the same. I also just think like testing new video like formats. Like I think, like Susan said, like I think we're very used to cutting, short form video, maybe 1 minute, maybe less, depending on, but it tends to be very like educational, to the point. It's either a talking head or it's like graphics on screen. One thing I'm excited to try out is just different formats, whether it be the specs of the video are going to be different, different types of storytelling, whether it's like graphics and, on screen with a person talking. Like I just think you can have a lot of fun with that. And for companies maybe like SaaS cloud software and fintech companies, it's a little harder to have fun. And now like this is our chance to be voicey and to like find the humor in our brands in some capacity while also keeping it educational. And that's what I think TikTok will allow us to do. So I'm excited to just test into it, which if anyone's on here and you're starting out in your social media career, know that, if a new platform starts, I remember when Peach started and my executive asked me if I had a Peach strategy the next day. And I was like, haven't even signed on to Peach yet. So no, always make sure that you have not only the right people in place in order to execute on a new social platform, but that you really think through your strategy before launching one, which sounds like Susan obviously is already fully prepping to do, but I'm doing the same on my end. You want to make sure that you have the right resources in place in order to be successful, or else you'll just set yourself up for failure. So that's just my 2 cents, because I always hear that from other social media colleagues who are like, oh, they expected me to have a TikTok platform strategy yesterday. And I'm like, what?
Yeah, that's the story of probably my decade-long career.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
to myself, but yeah, I think for me, from a B2B side, we're not so much dabbling in TikTok, but I think the main lesson here for all of you listening is also, aside from what Kelsey and Susan said and having the right plan and resources in place, also try out the platform yourself. Like really take the time, dive into it. Because what I like to say is when you are the one owning the strategy or being part of a strategy or a tactical plan, you still need to understand like how are consumers actually utilizing it? What are the pros and cons? What are the content that you're seeing? Because especially if you work in a corporate brand, one thing that we really need to look at is also brand safety too. So, your bosses or your boss's boss might ask you about that. So I think it's very important that you also test it out as a user. I think for me, my My biggest channel is still trying to, not so much emerging, but trying to figure out how to utilize LinkedIn for its other features as well too. Looking at LinkedIn Live and LinkedIn Stories and being able to utilize it more. As we might or might not know, LinkedIn Stories just came in beta just literally a year ago, and not every advertiser had a chance to tap into it. For me, it's how do I get to play around with that and influence our B2B audience a little bit more there. But anyways, we're at that time. We're excited to, of course, carry on with any Q&A. But Kelsey and Susan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and awesome examples of how you and your team have executed emerging trends and platforms, and looking forward to a bright future for next year and beyond. So thanks.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
Yep.